there are those factors that come into play in the decline in menarche in the last centuries, decades. We can look at other data, we find the same thing. The US, we have some data points down here from the 1910, 20, all the way to the 60s, some other European countries. So looking at menarche decline in 5 Western industrialized countries. So notice these, the data we have from these, we have looked at developing or non-developed and industrialized. And where the decline is happening is industrialized nations, developed nations that have good access, for the most part, to food and nutrition. Okay, they're not starving, they're not emaciated, they're not malnourished. These are the places where the number has gone down, 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 down. Okay, so right there, that should tell you it has to do with access to nutrition and food, right? So body weight and eating good has to be an element of that, because these are not the developing, they're the industrialized nations where we have this. We know there's strong correlations between better nutrition, okay, so access to food and more food, better food, body fat or BMI, because we can measure it simply with BMI if all we have is height and weight to work with, and decreased age of puberty. Those things are strongly correlated. Now, you guys over here, you brought up the point, well, it can't just be body fat and body weight alone. It can't just be that, because there's still people that reach puberty earlier and they're thin, they're small, right? And there's people that have more body fat and they reach it a little later. Like, that's not the only correlate, or that's not the only predictor, and that's true. But in general, overall, what holds up when we talk about menarche and the decline in the age of menarche is that more fat tells your brain you're ready to reproduce. And you guys kind of hit it right there in the back as well. You said you need more fat so before you can start cycling. So more fat tells your hypothalamus, you got stores, you got a little bit of stores, you got enough. We can start investing energy into becoming sexually mature. You're ready, you're sort of ready. So a big part of this is actual body fat. Now, it's not even, doesn't have to be a lot of body fat. It is a critical height, critical weight. Now, there's a lot of things that have been searched for actively. What we eat, the estrogenic compounds that we consume, the stuff, the stimuli that we're exposed to. People have even looked at noxious stimuli and more provocative sexual stimuli, and looking at sexual abuse and looking at pornography and all these different things. And we are bombarded by a lot more visual stimuli and signals of sexual related things than people have been in the past, right? You can pull up any phone or any tablet or computer. You could be 10 years old. You can pull up anything, really, unless you have parental advisory locks on that stuff. But otherwise, it's all over the place, okay? So there's been theories about that. There's been theories about food and diet and estrogenic disruptors or activators that act on the body. But I will say in general, the strongest factor that holds up is body weight and body fat. Because we can take girls that are from other countries that are developing or non-developed countries that are suffering and have starvation and they don't have access to good food and nutrition, and we could transplant or take those girls here, and this happens, we can look at adoption studies, and it's very clear. You can adopt a child from another country, a girl. She will adapt to the new industrialized, developed way, and she will no longer start menarche way later. Now she'll start it at like 12, 13, 14 years old. So taking on the sort of nutrition and surroundings of where she's at, because now she has better nutrition, she has more body weight, she has all of that. Now, another correlate that goes on with this, people don't realize. People that are early bloomers tend to be curvier and taller as girls and shorter as women. It holds up almost every single time, okay? So if you are an early bloomer, you got the height and the weight that was needed, the threshold, the critical threshold. Your brain went, okay, we got enough stores, we're ready to go. And you went into menarche, started becoming sexually mature, right? And then what happens is certain levels of estrogen over time, they're high levels. After a period of time, that causes your bones to close. That causes your growth plates to fuse. So it stops your growth. It makes you grow, and stop, okay? I'm almost 6 feet tall. I was a late bloomer. So I'm like the anecdotal description of this. I was a very late bloomer. My family was sort of, some people in my family are late bloomers. I just kept growing and growing and growing. I felt like the weird, ugly duckling, like tall and lanky, and all my friends are like, going through puberty and then stopping growing, and then I just continued growing, and then I started late. So when I say late, like 15 years old late, where I had, my cousin was 9. We were making like mud pies and climbing trees, and she was starting. So for me, I couldn't imagine starting that early. But same with her. She was kind of taller than me and more curvy and all that, and then she stopped growing. So now we're grown up, and she's here and I'm here. So this holds up oftentimes. That critical weight and mass get reached. You enter puberty, and then you're shorter as women in general. Now another part that plays into this is your genetics. There are genes that are linked with height and weight and body proportions. So if you come from a family of giants, you're probably going to be tall regardless of when you start cycling, right? You have that. So nutrition, genetics, and body weight or body fat, I would say. Nutrition and body fat, right? Getting that critical height and weight, and genetics and nutrition. Now, I can have all the genetics to be really tall, but if I'm starved, right, if I don't have access to good nutrition and vitamins and food and all those macromolecules, I am going to be stunted in growth. I'm not going to have growth hormone. I'm not going to have these cycling. I'm just not going to enter puberty because I don't have enough access. So it's a combination of nature versus nurture. What I want to ask you is, what do you think is the likely hormone signal? So a lot of you mentioned hormones in food, estrogenic compounds, maybe, kind of activating everything because we're exposed to so many hormonal disruptors. What do you think the likely hormone could be? And we've touched on this briefly when we were talking about the endocrine system already. GnRH is involved because that's the master sort of regulator of the reproductive cycling, yes. A hormone, your fat cells, your adipocytes are big, bubbly, filled with fat, right? Fat droplets inside them, they have nuclei, they get kind of pushed off to the edge. This is all fat inside there. Fat cells actually make a hormone that's called leptin. Leptin is a hormone that specifically comes from fat cells in proportion to the amount of fat. So if you have more triglycerides, I'll just say tris, more triglycerides inside your fat cells, I have more fat in my fat cells, that is going to lead to the production of more leptin. Now I'll have more leptin circulating in my blood and affecting my body, my tissues, and my endocrine system overall. Okay, so this is just one major factor that sort of goes along with that. Another thing is when you eat enough, when you eat a lot, say I'm not fasting and starving, but I'm like eating plentiful food, what hormone in my body is going to be going up, and then going up, and then going up every time I'm eating? Insulin. Insulin is another signal, another hormone signal that is actually going to affect the brain. It affects hunger, it affects different things in the brain. So these are signals that get released. These are hormonal signals that can affect reproduction, can affect puberty. So it depends on amount of body fat and also activity levels. So I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this. I know I had a couple conversations where it's common. This used to happen to me. I was a dancer, I was on cross country, I did track, so I was very, very active. And so I started cycling late, already felt awkward because everybody's already cycling. I'm the late bloomer and I'm tall. And in my dance, there's not a lot of guys that can even pick me up and throw me. I'm the one that has to like throw the dudes to do the, that was ballet for me. So I'm like, yeah, never gonna be a ballet dancer, just don't have the build. So getting it late, but then when I was very, very active, I didn't have a lot of body fat. I had more muscle, lean muscle mass than fat mass. I just stopped cycling altogether. No cycling. It's called amenorrhea. Like amenorrhea. Now I think it's great. Like, oh, I'm not cycling. Oh, wonderful. But when you're younger, you get nervous, sort of, right? And all of your age, you go, oh my gosh, I'm not cycling for 3 months, for 4 months, for 6 months, for a year. So that is fairly common when people have high exertion, not a lot of body weight, more muscle mass, and a lot of physical activity. Their reproductive system will shut down. Their GnRH goes, no, we don't want to divert energy into reproduction because we're already using a lot of energy, caloric expenditure here, here, and here. So I sort of just accepted that growing up. And this is a common thing. So you'll start cycling, start cycling, and then get amenorrhea, which in that case we call it secondary amenorrhea because you already started cycling, but now you stopped because of those body fat, physical activity levels, different things. So we need a critical height and weight that has to be reached. Regardless of your genetically predisposed size that's in your family, coming from your mom, your dad, your grandparents, and everybody else, is this sort of superimposed on that. It has genetic and environmental factors. One hormone that I mentioned, leptin, is really important. It's secreted by fat or adipose cells. It seems to be required for puberty. So if we don't have the production of leptin coming from fat cells, circulating in the blood, and then telling the brain, okay, go GnRH, you won't enter puberty, or puberty will be delayed. So leptin is specifically one of the keys that we know of that links amount of body fat, doesn't have to be a lot, just has to be sufficient, body fat with readiness to enter puberty. Does that make sense? And I know we have a tendency, a lot of reproductive biologists has looked at all the factors that you guys mentioned. This is one of the only ones that consistently holds up. Not to say that all these other factors aren't at play and confounding when someone will start, because that's very complex, but it's a big factor. This is one of the most predominant factors, okay? And I'll show you an example that might blow you away a little bit. It's called the OB and the DB mouse. Scientists would use animal studies to start figuring out what is the trigger or the gatekeeper for puberty. What determines when an organism, a female or male, enters puberty? So they knocked out these specific genes in mice. Here's an example, and they're so cute. I've worked with these in my PhD at UW. And I got to look at feeding experiments and look at hormone levels and look at the effects of different hormones on the brain. We've got the cute obese, OB, and it stands for obesity mouse, OB mouse. And it just eats and eats and eats. They're adorable. You pick them up, they're like 4 times the size of the other mice. They're just so cute. And they're slow. They just walk around, they're just eating. They have no desire to mate. Now, if you know mice and rodents, they mate. As soon as they're sexually mature, they're mating all the time. You have to separate the males and the females. You'll have just a giant entourage of mice running around everywhere, right? They have no desire. They love their food. They're like, I don't need a man. I just need lots of that mice chow. Just keep the mice chow in here so I can just keep eating. They don't enter puberty, actually. They don't even enter puberty. They don't develop the enlarged uterus and ovaries and start producing all the GnRH and FSH and LH and estrogen. They're perfectly happy, but they don't enter puberty. So they're infertile, no sexual maturation, they're fat, they're overweight, and they lack leptin. So their brain, their fat cells don't make leptin, it's mutated. So scientists were able to just mutate the leptin gene, see what happens. And the brain doesn't get the signal to stop eating, first of all. They're never satiated, they're always hungry, and it doesn't get the signal to start puberty, to go. So that right there tells you, okay, that's doing something important for feeding, body weight, and reproduction. There's another type called DB. So scientists looking at these and doing these animal studies, and by the way, this has now been done in lots of other animals. They started with the mouse. And actually researchers at UW, where I was, were the ones to sort of first start working on this. So it was very cool. I got to do research early on with some of these individuals. The DB mouse stands for diabetic mouse, okay, the DB. They end up having some issues with blood sugar. These are actually lacking the leptin receptor. So if they lack the leptin receptor, they make leptin from their body fat, adipose cells, but they don't make the leptin receptor. So their brain and other tissues can't read, oh, I have a lot of leptin. It's almost like they have no leptin. Even though they have a lot of leptin, they don't have a functional, they have a mutated leptin receptor. So we call that sort of the diabetic, the DB mouse. Again, the normal sibling, the DB genetic mutant. Again, chubby, infertile, super happy, never enters puberty. Okay, so you're like, oh, okay, so leptin and the leptin receptor, so it can signal, are very important. There are humans that have this exact situation. And there are rare but interesting examples where familial genes are passed down where the individual does not have the leptin molecule or the leptin receptor is mutated, and they are obese, very overweight, and they don't enter puberty if not treated, okay, so with reproductive hormones. So this actually recapitulates in human beings. So we know that leptin is important, and leptin plays a role in body weight regulation, feeding or hunger and appetite, and one of the gateways to puberty, starting sexual maturation. So if you think about it, I just want a philosophical sort of part of this. Reproduction is it take a lot of energy to build your body in new ways and to make new mature gametes every month, all the time. And then if you get pregnant, whether you're trying or not, if you get pregnant, is there a lot of energy that goes into rebuilding the tissues and nurturing and basically providing the space for that developing fetus and embryo? A lot of energy. Look at how much energy. Doubling, tripling the amount of energy that a normal female would take in. Lactation and nursing, forget about it. That's a whole other, you're burning calories like an Olympic triathlete, pretty much. You don't even realize it. Just know all the processes that go in and how much caloric expenditure you need. So if the body is going to be ready to do that, especially females, we're focusing on females for the most part, okay? This is where it's most tightly correlated to body weight and body fat. Because we, as females, have to endure all that energy that goes into that. So the brain, as soon as it gets any stimuli or cues that, you know what, you don't have enough energy. You don't have enough. You're too stressed out. You're too thin. You have a lot of muscle mass, not a lot of fat. You're physically running all over the place. We're not going to do that right now. We're going to shut all that down right now. We're conserving. It's a conservation of energy, okay, like thermodynamics. We don't have it, so we're not going to divert it into that. So you can not start to begin with, or you can stop cycling once you've already started. And that's primary amenorrhea or secondary amenorrhea. It's very common. So this makes sense. If you think about it, you need fat to have sex and reproduce and put the energy into it that it requires. All of that in becoming sexually mature is really important. This is a little schematic that shows exactly that. Adipose cells, they secrete, produce, and release leptin in proportion to how much adipose tissue there is, or fat, triglycerides there are. That tells the brain, okay, in feeding regulation, don't eat as much food. You're not as hungry. Decrease your food intake, right? We have good stores. We're good, so don't eat as much. So this is helping with body weight regulation and feeding. Same thing, the leptin in the blood affects neural networks in the brain that decreases, has effects on the GnRH neurons in the brain, and says, okay, we can go, we're seeing we have fat. It's almost like a fat stat. It's like a thermostat, it's like a fat stat. It goes, we have enough, we're seeing, okay, go ahead. Does that make sense? Okay, and I'm portraying this as this is the only factor. This is not the only factor. It's just a major link with body fat and body weight regulation and puberty. It's something that really holds up, and we can see it from animals to humans. Okay, so then this causes the pituitary gonadotropes, those cells in the anterior pituitary that make FSH and LH, they start dumping them out. So LH and FSH will tell the gonads, start making the sex steroids. And once those are happening, that causes the secondary sex characteristics and allows for cycling, the reproductive cycle, and the menstruating that happens every month in females. So I'm going to show you some examples, so hopefully we'll sort of convince you this is really important. Not to say other factors don't affect, like things you eat, stressors, drugs that you do, exposures, trauma, things you're exposed to, those all can affect sexual maturation and puberty. I'm not saying they're not important, but I'm saying the ones that have the most predominant effect are related to body fat and body weight, okay? Extreme exercise can inhibit GnRH secretion. So more active, slimmer girls typically begin puberty later, so they're later bloomers on average. Extreme physical activity, low body weight, anorexia nervosa, major stress can lead to delayed menarche, okay? We would say delayed menarche is primary amenorrhea because the female hasn't started yet ever, right? So it's primary, hasn't happened yet, this first cycling you haven't had yet, that's delayed, that's primary amenorrhea. Ballet dancers are a good example, gymnasts are a good example, runners, people that do a lot of active running, they don't even have to be super, super thin. That's the interesting thing, it doesn't always hold up with just pounds of weight. It's activity, it's lean muscle mass, it's body fat, it's all of those things together. And things like anorexia nervosa, that as well. There's definitely not enough body fat, right? So the brain is not getting those signals, we have enough energy, go. So the brain makes a decision, this integration center says, nope, no GnRH, can't do it. We have to survive and allow the tissues to survive before we can invest in producing another human, right? Okay, so body fat and puberty, we also have the secondary amenorrhea. So this is the stopping of menstrual cycle, cycling stops caused by inadequate FSH and LH from inadequate GnRH. So remember, these are all hormonal cascades. This is why the endocrine system is so important in tandem with the nervous system. They're all cascades, and if one is messed up, I don't get all the other ones. Or if I have too much of one, I get too much of all the other ones. It's these stop and go systems that really affect a lot of your physiology. So this can come from intense physical activity, stress, very low body fat. This is just an example. These are European women running, like track runners, like long distance marathon runners. They look, it looks like identical twins to me, but it might even be a superimposed thing, but I think they're different. They're in Europe somewhere, Sweden or something, I don't know, Germany, can't remember. But they have no, and I guarantee, I don't know this, I just took this, I hijacked this picture, but they're probably not cycling, is my guess. Can almost without a doubt say they have secondary amenorrhea. There's no way that they're having normal cycles and they're ovulating and they're having menses. Just, I would predict that that would not be the case. There's another hypothesis, and a lot of reproductive biology texts will talk about this and say that this can happen as well. This is a study from the 90s. If there's a very stressed child that goes through a lot of different parental, familial conflict and trauma, it kind of affects their maturation and their development and how they develop relationships and grow as an adolescent and an adult, whether they're sort of more unattached, insecure attachments versus attached and trusting, interpersonal relationships, how they are. And oftentimes there's been a few studies that have found they have an earlier puberty or earlier sexual maturation when they're exposed to a lot of trauma and stressors in their familial life growing up. There's contradictory studies on this though. Sometimes they're not necessarily controlling for body weight, body fat, all those things. They're just looking at some of these sociological, psychological factors and not every other kind of factor. So some of these I don't, especially if they don't have information on body weight. For me, height and weight, body weight, just the general, and some of the genetics, father and mother, for me that's lacking. That lacks quite a bit of data. But some of them actually had all-encompassing data. And what some found is that individuals with more of that trauma will enter puberty earlier. And there are theories about why this is. It's kind of this theory of early childhood family stressors accelerating sexual maturation. And the idea is almost like an evolutionary fitness. If there's going to be trauma and they're not going to survive, the brain goes, okay, well maybe we should start early so we can reproduce and we can have an offspring before we're gone. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know if I 100% buy into that. I'm not totally convinced because I've looked at so much data and I've looked at genetics of these myself in women and when they started, when they stopped, so menarche and menopause. So much of it is sort of genetics and body weight. Like so much of it is that you can alter those factors and you can alter that person's sort of when they start. So a lot of it is genetics and also the body fat and body weight and body height kind of feed into that. But I just want you to know this is a component, and there is research that finds that this holds up. At least in some cases, this holds up. Does that make sense to you? Why? Okay. For me, I still have sort of issues with that, but I can see how it happens, and I can see why. Evolutionarily speaking, I can sort of see why. So when everything is nice and good, and the child with less stress, typically they found that they had later maturation, later puberty. So again, got to control for body, weight, height, fat, parents, all that stuff. So, female reproductive anatomy and physiology. I realized that maybe I could have done this first, but I thought it would be better to go sort of how you mature, how the brain wakes up, gets you into sexual maturation zone, and then what does the body and the characteristics and the anatomy sort of look like. So I'm going sort of developmental. We're going up to now the full-fledged reproductive male and female. We'll start with the male. So the reproductive system is involved in the production of gametes, so sperm and eggs, and fertilization and procreation of species. It's also involved in regulating other organ systems, okay? So it's very important in allowing a species to continue to survive, to stay extant and not go extinct. If the male and females, if a sexually reproducing species, are actively producing gametes and allowing fertilization to happen. So the primary sex organs are the testes and the ovaries, and the accessory sex characteristics are all the additional organs and glands and ducts, and like the mammary glands, all those structures that aid. They don't make the sex steroids or the gametes, but they help in reproduction. And they're all the different glands and external genitals and parts that we're going to talk about. So I want to just start on the gametes because that really starts at the microscopic level of what's different between males and females. Okay, so when they're sexually mature, males will produce sperm. These are human sperm right here. This is an image, a video that I took. Their head is right there, tail or the flagellum. They are highly specialized. They have a unique morphology and physiology. So they have a head, they have a midpiece, and they have a tail. They are built for exactly what they need to do. So they have all those components. The head is packed with DNA, so the head is really condensed with the chromosomes, packed in there. The haploid chromosomes, 23 chromosomes, packed inside of the nucleus, inside of the head. They're basically a DNA delivering machine. They want to get the DNA to the egg. They want to be successful. They got to sniff it out. Literally, there are olfactory receptors on sperm heads. Find the egg, fertilize it, and start the generation of a new individual or the starting of an embryo. So they can live in the female reproductive tract. Now, lower estimates of this used to be like 2 or 3 days. I sort of said 5 days, extended it based on research of others in the field and myself, and can live more than that probably in the female reproductive tract, because there are for sure anecdotal stories and situations where we find that sperm actually can live. There are still living sperm in the female tract longer than 5 days. And I was doing studies where I was doing in vitro studies. I was imaging sperm. I was treating them with different chemicals because I was trying to see how it would affect their fertilization potential and their swimming. And I forgot, I was imaging these cells on the microscope kind of down in the dungeon. I did a lot of dark stuff. I'd go in there, close the curtain, I'd be gone for like 8 hours. So I'm imaging these cells, and I was trying to get out of there quick to catch my bus and get home to my kid, my daughter and my family. So I'm like, oh, I gotta go. I forgot to dispose of the cells or like put it back in the incubator or the fridge, and I just left them on the counter. No one goes down there, not many people except for me, but I had my little Eppendorf tube with my sperm and their little media, and I capped it so they were closed, so it was not a lot of oxygen, room temperature, not even warm, 37 degrees. It gets acidic in there, so there's a lot of lowered pH. And then I came back the next day. I realized when I go, oh my gosh, I left human sperm on the counter in a little tube. Oh my gosh, I hope no one goes down there. So I came back there the next day, and it was probably at this point 30 hours later, 29 hours later, going on like the second day. And I went, oh, I wonder if they're still alive. That's interesting. And so I don't know if my video is going to play, because sometimes it doesn't play in here. But these were a couple of little suckers that are just still swimming around. That was quick. If you blinked, you missed it. And this is sitting at room temperature, and they swim like a corkscrew. They swim like corkscrew. They do like this. No oxygen, 25 degrees room temperature, in the dark, acidic because there's acid being produced in there. And there were still some live ones. I thought, that's like 30 hours plus at room temperature. They live longer than 2 days in the female reproductive tract. And there are studies looking at mice and rabbits and sheep and humans. They do. They can live long. So people that think they can do like the rhythm method, like, oh, I'm not ovulating right now. Oh, watch out. I know lots of people that got pregnant exactly doing that. They went, they can only live like 2-3 days. And then here's when I'm ovulating. Here's when I'm fertile and when I'm not. And they got pregnant. That's exactly how they got pregnant. So they can live a long time. Okay, so let that be a warning. They don't die and they're all crippled and dead within the first 24 hours. That's not how it happens. The strongest swimming, survival of the fittest, they're going to hang out in there. They're waiting. They're waiting for their opportunity to be a star. Okay? They want to reach the egg. Average man can make sperm his entire life. This is different than women. Women can't make eggs their entire life. You have all the eggs as a female you're going to have before the time of birth. And they're lost throughout life until you reach menopause, and they're all gone. So a man has spermatogonial stem cells in their testes from before birth that wake up at puberty with testosterone, LH, FSH. These wake up the testes and the gametes, and they start going through meiosis, and they start developing. First they go through mitosis, and then they go through meiosis, and they make the sperm. This can happen the entire life. A man can be 90 years old and can father a child. Yes. And actually, my grandpa was very old when he fathered a child. I think he was 70, 75. Yeah, it's interesting because then his daughter is like younger than my mom. They're sisters. It's very interesting. He remarried. So men can procreate for a very long time. It takes about 75 days for mature sperm to develop in the testes. So they go through the meiosis, phases of meiosis, and then they mature and they grow a tail. It takes about 2.5 months. This is just trivia that I calculated. It's kind of funny. A man can make 4,000 sperm per heartbeat on average. That's how many are made. It's almost like a sperm-producing machine. I hate to say that. I'm not. But that's what every single heartbeat, if you have 60 to 70 heartbeats per minute, you do the math, you figure out how many seconds are in a 24-hour period, and I know how many sperm are produced in the average man. It comes out to be 4,000 per heartbeat. So it's pretty dramatic, okay? So the overall, we'll focus on the male first, and then we'll go into the female right after this on Wednesday. Male reproductive system, here's the bladder, okay? And there's the rectum, so the large intestine and the rectum. So where the external genitals are here, the testes are within the scrotum. There's the glans penis, or the end, the actual shaft of the penis. There's a urethra. So this is the opening or the tube that goes all the way through, and we can trace it. And it actually goes back to the vas deferens, or the ductus deferens, which goes to the epididymis, which goes right from the testes. So where sperm are made are right there in the testes. So they're made here, there's spermatogonial stem cells there. They mature, they move to the epididymis, which looks like a comma-shaped structure right on top of the testes, like a comma. They exit here. When they're going to be ejaculated, they're stored here, and then they follow through the vas deferens. They enter the ejaculatory duct at the time of emission, and then at the time of ejaculation, they go out the urethra and then out the actual orifice, urethral orifice of the penis. Okay? And notice urine coming from, so we also have the bladder, here's the bladder, and ureters. They actually also drain as well into the urethra. So it's a common duct for both. And there's glands here. There's a gland here. There's a gland here. This is the prostate gland. This is the bulbourethral glands. And these all produce and put in fluid to make the seminal fluid. And actually, to get rid of traces of acidic urine, before the actual sperm travel in the seminal fluid through the urethra and out the actual external genitalia. Okay, or the penis. I guess I will end with penis today. Okay, so we'll get into vagina and uterus on Wednesday. Okay, that was awkward, but it is what it is.